morning, everybody. Welcome to the MedFi 2022 virtual conference. We're so happy to see you. Wish that we could be together. I'd like to start by welcoming everyone with our land acknowledgement slide. We acknowledge that the lands on which we're hosting this meeting include the traditional territories of many nations. The work of MedFi and our partners takes place on traditional territories of the Indigenous nations who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. MedFi is located in Toronto, on the ancestral homelands of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Atchawinderons. This is Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory. MedFi is committed to reconciliation. We recognize that the many injustices experienced by the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada continue to affect their health and well-being. We respect and embrace the rich cultural and traditional practices of the ancestors. We invite our partners to reflect on the territories where they are situated and to join us in committing to gaining knowledge, forging a new culturally safe relationship, and contributing to reconciliation. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Catherine Zahn, Deputy Minister, Ontario Ministry of Health, who has a welcome for our conference.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Catherine Zahn, Deputy Minister of Health for Ontario. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning, and thank you to Dr. Jennifer Wyman for the invitation to attend. First of all, I'd like to say how much I appreciate the work of the MedFi team at Women's College Hospital and the Rapid Access Addiction Medicine teams across the province for all you do to support the mental health and well-being of Ontarians who live with substance use disorders. In 2020, the Ministry of Health asked MedFi to become the clinical practice hub for the Rapid Access Addiction Medicine, or RAM clinics, in Ontario. The goal was to create teams to support the delivery of standardized, evidence-informed practices across RAM services and to be a source of information and advice for provincial policymakers. The opioid overdose crisis provided the impetus for provincial investment in RAM clinics. This is a situation that sadly you're addressing with a shocking frequency. I want you to know that your work is seen and it's been central to mitigating the impact of opioid use. But addiction is a problem that extends well beyond opioid use. Estimates of population health needs based on StatsCan data show that nearly half of Ontarians have a diagnosable substance use disorder, with alcohol and cannabis being the most common substances that are misused. While that estimate represents people across a spectrum of clinical needs, it emphasizes the fact that too many Ontarians feel the need to turn to substance use to cope with day-to-day life. On a system level, RAM clinics are filling a gap in the care continuum. Transitions in care are a well-documented challenge to quality health care, exposing patients to fragmented care and delays in access to services. These clinics are designed to mitigate this through low-barrier walk-in services. It means that clients can access the treatment services they need when they're ready. Once an individual is stabilized, RAM clinics help them to transition to a longer-term care provider. The interdisciplinary model of RAM clinics is also important. Clinic staff benefit from the collaboration and exposure to other professions and levels of experience and expertise. The model improves the likelihood that clients can move seamlessly among service providers such as physicians, nurses, social workers, and case managers. The Ministry of Health is proud to be a supporter of the MedFi network and the important work that you do. Your commitment has enhanced the quality of services and supports that people living with mental illness, including substance use disorders, have available to them when they are most in need. Thank you again for your time today, and my sincere gratitude to all of you for supporting Ontarians with these challenging health conditions.
Thank you to Dr. Zahn for that welcome. We're next going to turn to a brief presentation by Dr. Kahan about the substance use crisis in Ontario and the addiction field's response. Most of you, I would think, know Mel at this point. Dr. Kahan has worked in the addiction field for many years. He's medical director of PHI, a staff physician in the substance use service at Women's College Hospital, former director here at Women's, where I am, and a mentor to me and to many others. Dr. Kahan has written a number of peer-reviewed articles on addiction. He's been a principal or co-principal investigator on many research studies, including randomized trials and observational studies. He's been extensively involved in policy and advocacy and worked tirelessly to advance care for people with substance use disorders. He's helped write several guidelines and has co-authored handbooks and guidance documents on addiction medicine. His main interest is the integration of addiction medicine into primary care, emergency departments, and hospital units. Thanks.
Hello, I am Mel Kahan. I'm the medical director of the PHI program, and I'd like to say a few words about the current situation that we find ourselves in as addiction clinicians. This is a unique time in our history. And we are unquestionably in the midst of the gravest public health crisis in modern times, and that for sure includes COVID. Harms from both alcohol and opiates are increasing. They were increasing in the years prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has greatly accelerated these trends. For the first time in modern history, the population's average lifespan is trending downwards, and this is due in large part to increasing deaths from alcohol, opiates, and suicide. This is an example. This is opiate-related morbidity in Ontario from the Interactive Opiate Tracker. You can see ED visits, and this is just 1 month at a time, not a year at a time. So in January 2003, when the OxyContin epidemic was underway, there were 99 ED visits related to opiates and 23 deaths. By January 2016, there were 357 ED visits and 77 deaths. That was when the fentanyl crisis was first hitting Ontario. And December 2021, there were 1,500 ED visits and 257 deaths. This is now looking at years, recent years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. This is 2019 was before the COVID. You can see 1,500 deaths. 2021, it had increased by 900 deaths, and by 2021, it was now 2,880 deaths. Alcohol harms are also increasing, perhaps not as rapidly, but alcohol still remains the #1 cause of morbidity and mortality in Ontario. Between 2003 and 2016, age standardized rates of alcohol-related problems increased by 86.5% for women and 53% for men. Young women showed the greatest rate of increase. The 1-year mortality rate for people who visited the ED 2 or more times in 1 year for alcohol-related reasons was 5.4%, which is about the same rate of death as fentanyl users. In Ontario in 2020, there were 75,000 ED visits directly related to alcohol and 420 deaths. Now, that is certainly an underestimate. There are many more deaths where alcohol was a major contributor, but not the sole cause of death. Harms are also increasing for other drugs. Cannabis-related ED visits have increased markedly in Ontario following legalization and commercialization of cannabis. Crystal meth is now the most commonly used drug among people accessing harm reduction services in BC, more so than opiates, alcohol, or cannabis. And this is, I think, likely true for Ontario as well. Prescribing of benzodiazepines as well as illicit benzodiazepines have also increased, and ED visits related to illicit and prescription benzodiazepines are also going up. This has had a profound impact on us, on the people working in the field. It's increased our own sense of helplessness, our own frustration, our own grief. As patients with complex and severe substance use disorders do not respond as well to treatment and are more likely to drop out compared to socially stable substance users. So a very huge difference between a prescription OxyContin user who was using only orally and was socially stable compared to a fentanyl user. We're also facing lack of resources. Certainly, our public health system has not responded nearly as vigorously or in a coordinated fashion to the substance use crisis as it has to COVID. Patients are dying, and we feel grief for that. Some patients are dying suddenly through a fentanyl overdose. Some patients are dying slowly from alcohol-related liver disease. We're experiencing disruptions in service and staffing, uncertain and inadequate resources to deal with the problems we face, and pretty profound complacency on the part of government and healthcare institutions. But we have a tremendous amount to be proud of. Necessity, as this saying goes, is the mother of invention. Addiction clinicians throughout Ontario are implementing major changes in their clinics and in the settings that they work in. I would say, as an old-timer who's been around long before the OxyContin crisis, let alone the fentanyl crisis, I can say that there's been greater changes in the addiction field in the last 2 years than in the preceding 30 years. And there's also, I believe, greater changes in our field than in any other healthcare field. And this takes tremendous amount of hard work and persistence and courage as we're fighting against the grain. And again, in terms of a rigid and unresponsive system in hospitals, in the addiction field, and in the government. So one example, and it's certainly not the only example, of positive change is the new opiate agonist treatment protocols that have been designed to increase opiate agonist treatment engagement and retention among people who use fentanyl. As we know that the current protocols for titrating methadone and buprenorphine are not as effective for fentanyl users as for people who use prescription opiates. And these are some small examples, and we'll be discussing them in the conference as we go along. Macrodosing and microdosing of buprenorphine, depot buprenorphine, slow release oral morphine, methadone in combination with slow release oral morphine, and liberalization of policies regarding take-home doses and urine drug screens. So there's been a rapid adoption of these protocols in many addiction and healthcare settings as people are taking this crisis very seriously. Other positive trends, I think there's no question, there's a greater use of anti-craving medications for alcohol use disorder. We're seeing government responding to the lack of person power and resources in addiction institutions by hiring nurse practitioners and withdrawal management services and residential programs. Withdrawal management services, many of them now have the capacity to provide medication-assisted treatment for alcohol withdrawal and opiate and alcohol use disorder. There's also an increasing number of emergency departments and hospitals that are setting up addiction consult services, staffed by clinicians, counselors, and peer workers. Finally, RAM clinics continue to expand in number and in services provided, and the ministry continues to provide resources and support for RAM clinics. So thank you very much, and hope you all enjoy the conference.
Thanks for that overview. If anyone has perspective, it's Mel on the history of changes in trends and in care in this province. It's my pleasure now to introduce Anne-Marie Corrado, who is our Acting Network Director for PHI, while Kate is on leave. And Anne-Marie will give us an overview of PHI's activities over the last little while and projects to come. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak to some of the important work that MediFi has been doing to support the delivery of high quality care for people across Ontario who use substances. So I want to start with some background information. So in 2015, as many of you know, MediFi was funded as a pilot project to establish 7 RAM clinics across Ontario. And the pilot sites showed that people who attended a RAM clinic had fewer ED visits and hospitalizations. In 2020, MediFi then became the official provincial hub for RAM clinics. And now in 2022, we are proud to share that the province is funding 75 RAM clinics. RAM clinics are based on 5 operating principles. So the first is that RAM clinics are staffed at a minimum by a prescriber and by a counselor. The second is that patients can be seen without an appointment or referral. The third is that all substance use disorders are treated. The fourth is that medical treatment and psychosocial counseling are provided on the first visit. And the fifth is that the RAM clinic is part of an integrated care pathway between the ED, withdrawal management service, and community agencies. So I'm now going to take a moment to highlight some of MediFi's accomplishments over the past 2 years. So as you know, MediFi focuses on training, education, and networking. And some of the ways we do this are we host our annual conference, which we are thrilled to have you all at today with us. We facilitate monthly video calls for RAM prescribers, counselors, registered nurses, and nurse practitioners. We also host monthly webinars and disseminate monthly newsletters. We create and disseminate educational materials for both clinicians and patients. We maintain a listserv of over 1,200 addiction providers across Canada, and we facilitate connections between sites. MediFi also supports clinicians in a number of ways. So one of the ways is that we create and disseminate various clinical tools. And all of these clinical tools can be found on our website. So we really encourage you to download the ones that are of interest. You will also notice on this slide that we have many tools that are upcoming. So we also encourage you to keep an eye out for these tools as they get uploaded on our website. MediFi also offers one-to-one consultations to troubleshoot barriers to providing care, and we have information bulletins. Another area in our role is to provide provincial oversight of the RAM clinics. So some of the ways we do this are we work with our RAM funders to ensure ongoing fidelity to the RAM model. We maintain an online provincial RAM directory. Many of you will remember that in 2021, we had the first environmental scan of the RAM clinics, and we are now in the process of creating a quality targets document. And this document outlines the administrative, clinical, and community targets that MediFi views as defining quality care and that RAM clinics should strive to meet. Its purpose is to provide clear goals and measurable indicators so that sites can evaluate their performance, measure their progress, and identify areas in which they would benefit from additional support. So that is something very exciting that is to come. And MediFi, as many of you know, advocates for system-level change. So on behalf of the entire MediFi team, I would now like to take a moment to express my gratitude to the following groups of individuals that partner with us on our projects and initiatives to really ensure their quality and their success. The first group is our community consultants. They are a diverse group of people with lived and living experience of substance use, and they work with us to ensure that our knowledge products are inclusive, are respectful, and are informed by their knowledge. I would also like to thank our stakeholders working in the addiction medicine field And these include prescribers, counselors, nurses, and administrators who share their subject matter expertise with us, as well as their lessons learned from their years of experience working in the field. And I would also like to thank our MediFi Provincial Advisory Committee. This committee was established in 2020 to provide interdisciplinary, geographically diverse perspectives, including from those with lived and living experience, on the mentorship, education, and clinical supports provided by the MediFi program. I would like to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to share this information with you. I really hope that you enjoy your first day of the conference, and I will now hand it back to Dr. Jennifer Wyman.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks for that great overview. So I realized that I didn't introduce myself. I just assumed that everyone knows who I am as I look at this slide of the MediFi team. I'm Jennifer Wyman, medical educator. It's a bit funny to see a picture of myself and be introducing myself. Before doing some of the housekeeping and orientation to the day and the platform, I really want to acknowledge this very small but mighty team who work together incredibly collaboratively and energetically to be able to respond quite quickly to changes that come up and to produce such an array of products, of guidelines and initiatives, as Anne-Marie discussed. Anne-Marie is our network director, stepping in for Kate, and we're so grateful to have her. Mel, as you know, is our medical director. And Mel is not with us in person today, but he's well and he'll be tuning in. Katie Dunham is our nurse educator and nurse practitioner who brings such a wealth of experience and perspective from the community. And probably all of you have seen Sarah and Lori's names on many emails. This conference would truly not have been possible without them. The amount of behind the scenes work to make all of this happen is absolutely indescribable. So I owe them just a huge, huge thanks. And I hope that as we go through the day, some of you will post your pictures along with your names. We're missing seeing people in person. This being our third virtual conference, hoping to have a chance to chat with people today through the platform and really hoping that we can be together and see each other in person going forward. But please post your pictures. It's really nice to have faces to go with names. And thank you again to Sarah and Lori. I'd also like to thank our conference planning committee who brought breadth and depth in terms of perspective and suggestions and really helped to form the overall structure and some of this and the specific content. Rachel Alexander, Sean LeBlanc, Josh Richardson, Leslie Buckley, Leslie Molnar, Anita Srivastava, Christina Henry, Lori Regenstreif, and Maria Zhang. I'd like to thank our presenters and moderators. I am confident that you will enjoy their presentations today. Dr. Catherine Zahn, Deputy Minister of Health for the province, for her introduction. AV Canada, our background, everything in terms of making sure that this program works. And Brent Logan, who has been extraordinarily helpful with respect to our design. So a bit of housekeeping and overview of the day. We'll shortly begin our plenary session with David Frank, following which we'll have a break so everyone can attend to their needs and then hopefully rejoin to be able to concentrate and really participate in our sessions. We have 3 parallel sessions throughout the day. In the morning, we'll have 1-hour concurrent sessions, followed by lunch and networking. I'm going to speak more about networking in a moment, but really hope that you'll join us. The afternoon, we'll have parallel workshops, followed by the poster presentation sessions and 1 more parallel session to wrap up the afternoon. Tomorrow morning, we start again at 8:30 directly into workshops. There isn't a sort of overview, so 8:30 is when workshops start. Please join us for that. Again, following a break, we'll have 1-hour sessions. And then tomorrow at lunch, we'll have a yoga and movement session with Nancy Silverman, hoping that people will be able to take a little bit of time out of sitting to get re-energized, because the rest of the afternoon will be really interesting as well. And that session will start between 12:10 and 12:15, so people have a chance to get their mats, find somewhere comfortable. It's really all level and nothing too strenuous, but a nice chance for us to move and get re-energized for our afternoon session and our wrap-up panel discussion, which is an evaluation of services for people who use drugs, key findings and recommendations from the Marcos study. And that will be, I'm sure, a really interesting and also, I think, sort of a multimedia presentation. A reminder, please, to fill out your evaluation forms. There will be evaluation forms for each session that should pop up in the session, as well as a feedback form for the end of each day. And these are really critical to helping us plan our content and all of our events going forward. So we appreciate all of your feedback. Accreditation letters will be sent within 10 to 14 days after the end of the conference. How to use the platform. Probably everyone but me has already figured it out. I think the video is really helpful, but just poke around a little bit to look at the different icons on the top and on the side of your screen. There are lots of ways to interact, and I really hope that you'll take advantage of them. You'll see the event feed, which is really just like a post to everyone on the far right side of your screen. You can also message someone directly using the little sort of send paper airplane sign. If you go to the people icon on that right, you'll be able to see all of the presenters and attendees. You can send a message to someone directly through that access, as well as request a time to meet. And then you'll actually get a little pop-up reminder in your notification window that they've accepted and when that meeting time is taking place. We're trying something new today because we're really missing the chance to sit down and chat together. At lunchtime, the lounge will be open and you'll see a little couch button at the top of your screen around lunchtime. If you click on there, you'll be able to see a number of different tables, and you can literally pick your table, sit down beside someone that you know, or maybe even better, someone that you don't know, to have a chat about how the day is going, get to know people, learn where they're coming from, and engage. Bring your lunch. You don't have to be off screen. This is a nice chance to just take some space and get to know each other at the same time. The lounge is also where you'll go to meet the poster presenters and the exhibitors. The poster presentations and the exhibitions are available for viewing throughout the conference. You go to the booths section that's at the top of your screen. You can also send a message to any of the exhibitors or presenters through the day, but you'll visit the lounge between 3 and 4 to, again, have some live chats with the presenters and exhibitors. Other ways to present, of course, please tweet if there's something that catches your interest and you think would be great for other people to hear about. And lastly, our leaderboard. Nothing complicated. You don't have to answer any skill testing questions. You just have to post a question, a picture, check out someone else's photo or ID or bio. There are lots of suggestions for how to get points in that little points icon as well. And then you'll be able to see how you stack up against others. There are some prizes for the top 3 participants that we'll announce at the end of tomorrow. Lastly, for any technical support at all, click on the help button, that bright blue button at the bottom left of your screen. The AV Canada team is standing by, and we know that they'll be able to help answer any of your questions. So if there are any questions that have to do with technical issues, don't message Lori or Sarah, who have been your go-to for everything else until this moment. The AV team are our backup for the next couple of days. So please enjoy the conference. As I said, we really look forward to hearing from people as we go. And we welcome you to what I am sure will be a very full and engaging 2 days. It's my pleasure now to move into introducing David Frank for our keynote session, Repositioning Methadone Maintenance Treatment, or MMT, within the context of criminalization. David Frank is a medical sociologist and research scientist at New York University's School of Global Public Health. His research focuses primarily on opioid use treatment programs like medication-assisted treatment, MAT, and the structural and policy context in which opioid use and treatment occurs. He's also someone who has been on methadone maintenance treatment for more than 15 years and uses those experiences in his research to produce scholarship that more accurately reflects the lives of people who use illegal substances. Dr. Frank is currently working on a NIDA diversity supplemental study that examines the role of opioid withdrawal in MAT treatment initiation and overdose risk behaviors. And he's also participating in other projects that seek to reframe MAT as a form of harm reduction. I will say that his work has informed some of ours and mine here at Medify with respect to our approaches to looking at methadone as harm reduction and looking at the ways in which methadone can and should be made more person-centered, including our new CARI guideline framework, which we'll be presenting tomorrow. David Frank is committed to using his dual role as a scholar with lived experience of drug use to amplify the voices of people who use drugs and to dismantle the systems that negatively impact their lives. I've been looking forward to this talk for quite a while. Welcome, David, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that wonderful introduction. I don't know what to say for my first slide because you took away my own introduction, but it was much better than I could do. So thank you very much. I appreciate Medify. Thank you for having me speak. It's my pleasure to be here. I do wish I could be there in person, not only because it's just much better, but because I'm the kind of speaker that usually gets up and paces around, and it's a little constraining for me in my chair. So if any mistakes I make are due to that, not legitimate mistakes. But thank you. As Jennifer mentioned, I am a medical sociologist. I'm at New York University's School of Global Public Health. My work is on opioid use. Most of my work focuses particularly on methadone maintenance, a little bit of buprenorphine, but mostly methadone maintenance. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, as Jennifer mentioned, I am on methadone maintenance, and I've been on for, I lose track of time. It's maybe 20 years at this point. It's definitely more than 15 years. But I do try to use, I'm open about that, obviously, I'm open about that, but I'm open about that in my research as well. And I'll talk about that in the course of my presentation. But I do try to use that sort of dual identity to bring the voices of people with lived experience who I felt were not getting, whose voices were not in the conversation nearly as much. And I try to address that to the best I can. So my talk today is called Repositioning Methadone Maintenance Treatment Within the Context of Criminalization. And I'm going to talk about what I see as a discrepancy between the way that treatment is conceptualized and practiced and the way that people on methadone actually use and benefit from it. And I'm going to argue that in contrast to the way that methadone is generally thought about, which is as a form of addiction treatment, generally considered, it's meant to help addicts attain recovery or help addicts become abstinent, that I would argue that it's much better understood as a form of harm reduction, as a strategy that people use in a lot of different ways to reduce the harms of criminalization. And I'm also going to argue further that if we kind of can accept that and lean into that harm reduction understanding of methadone, that we could adopt much better practices and protocols that would in fact reduce all the massive problems that we're seeing with illicit opioid use now, most notably, of course, overdose, but we still have, Hep C and HIV and just the general rough quality of life that a lot of criminalized opioid users are forced to endure. So let me go to the next slide. Hopefully this is going to work. Okay, it didn't. Okay, now it did. Here are my disclosures. So I have received funding from the U.S. National Institute of Health. I'm working on a diversity supplement, as Jennifer mentioned. I've also got 2 pilot grants from NYU. I don't really have any conflict of interests, at least none that I know about. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. So I wanted to start with some background information. I imagine a lot of you know some of this stuff, but for those of you who don't, it's an important starting place. And besides, it's tough to fill up an hour's time, so indulge me on this. Methadone is a synthetic opioid, which means it's made in a lab as opposed to growing from an opioid poppy plant like morphine or heroin. Yet it's made to closely resemble those. It has the same kind of properties. One of those properties being what we call cross tolerance. And that really means that all opioids could kind of substitute for one another. So if you're someone who uses heroin every day and you don't have any and you're going into withdrawal, if you take methadone, it will address that. You will no longer be in withdrawal. And same thing, vice versa. If you're someone who takes methadone or whatever, Oxycontin, Dilaudid, any of the other opioids, although there's differences between them, but the differences are minimal. They all produce euphoria. They all reduce your breathing rate. They all make you constipated. They all do the same kind of thing. But just to address some of the differences, methadone does have a longer half-life than what we call short-acting opioids like heroin. And what that basically means is it lasts longer. It takes longer to leave your system. And that's part of why it's clinically effective. Whereas short-acting opioids are kind of like you might imagine them as like a mountain. So, and that's kind of why it has more euphoria. You get high from it and then it goes down quicker. But methadone's more like, it's not like the mountain, it's like the hill. So it lasts longer and it's less euphoric. Although I always have to make this caveat, it is totally euphoric. People like make a big deal about how it's not euphoric. Of course it's euphoric, it's an opioid. People use it recreationally. And I think probably a lot of the emphasis on trying to say that methadone is not euphoric is for political pragmatic reasons that maybe are short-sighted. So I always like to point out, I feel my dose of methadone. It's awesome. I love taking it every morning with a cup of coffee. It's wonderful. So yeah, it is totally euphoric, like all opioids are euphoric. But it's less euphoric, I will admit to that, than heroin. And of course, the other things matter too, like route of administration, and you take methadone generally orally. Okay, so here we go. Okay. So a little bit of the history on methadone maintenance treatment. Did I skip a slide too far? No, I didn't. Okay. So methadone maintenance treatment, the using methadone in this clinical application, it originated in New York City in the 1960s and 1970s. I'm in New York City right now, the home of methadone maintenance. It's generally associated with Doctors Dole and Neiswander, a physician and a psychiatrist, who were working with people who use drugs who hadn't really responded well to traditional forms of treatment. And they realized, hey, if we give these people an opioid every day so that they won't have to do all the things that they have to do to get opioids, that will probably make their lives better and reduce their symptomology. And in fact, of course, it did. And that led to the growth of methadone maintenance treatment. It's referred to as a substitution-based treatment, which basically means it substitutes for one drug for another. It substitutes legal for illegal opioids, or methadone for heroin, however you want to think about that. It's maintenance-based, so it's not intended to be stopped at any particular time, although people do stop using methadone, and there's a lot of good reasons to stop using methadone, mostly related to the treatment and the way it's applied. But it's intended indefinite. You could stay on methadone forever. I will stay on methadone forever, with the exception if they legalize heroin, I'm off in that day. So methadone is delivered in opioid treatment programs, methadone clinics. They can't be obtained through primary care. You can't get it for your doctor unless you are getting it for pain management. And that's, of course, is a gray area. I'm not going to get too into that. But if you're officially a pain patient, you could get your methadone through a primary care provider if you're a quote unquote addict. And by the way, I should just state this at the beginning. I will use the word addict in my presentation. I don't like it. I don't like the concept of addiction. I'm very critical of it, but there's not a lot of other words to use. And, you know, you could maybe imagine that I'm making quotes around it when I say addict. Methadone is highly regulated and highly punitive. And I'm going to talk a lot about this in the course of my presentation. Okay. So important to know some of the benefits of methadone, and there are many. It's often referred to as the gold standard of treatment for opioid use. There's been probably hundreds of studies over the last 40, 50 years that talk about how methadone reduces rates of illegal substance use, reduces overdose, reduces transmission of bloodborne diseases like Hep C and HIV, and generally helps people become more stable. It improves their quality of life. Hold on, I'm on the page here. I knew I was not reading something right. But here's the caveat. It's really unpopular amongst people who use drugs, both people in methadone and people not in methadone. So it's got really low rates of patient satisfaction. And as a result of that, it also has really low rates of use and retention. So it's kind of hard to find a good statistic on this because it's like a hidden population, but you often hear between 5 and 15% of people who quote unquote have opioid use disorder, or we might think of people who might benefit from methadone maintenance. Only 5 to 15% are at any given time involved in the program. And people also drop out at incredibly high rates in the US. And again, as a caveat, most of the statistics I'll cite or even policies that I'll cite are from a US context. I do have a lot of friends involved with methadone advocacy in Canada, and I know there's a lot of similarities, probably more similarities than there are differences, but there are differences, and I'd actually be interested in hearing about them maybe in the question period. But the statistics I'll cite are from a US context, so keep that in mind. But like half the patients are dropping out every year. They often cycle in and out of methadone. When the program becomes too much of a pain in the neck, they drop out. And then when being a quote unquote heroin addict on the street becomes too much of a pain in the neck, they cycle back in. So it's not an ideal clinical setup. People don't like it and they don't use it, even though it does a lot of good things. Okay. I wish I had some way of monitoring my time, but maybe if I do go on really far, which isn't going to happen for a long time, but they'll let me know. Okay, so recovery-oriented methadone maintenance, ROM it's sometimes called, and this isn't always the exact term they use to describe methadone. It sometimes is, but it describes the way that methadone is conceptualized in the United States. It's kind of like a 12-step program with methadone included. In that it's aimed towards treating your addiction, turning you from an addict into someone in recovery. And recovery in this setting is defined here as a voluntarily maintained lifestyle characterized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. It's a holistic model, so it's focused on changing the whole individual. You're conceptualized as an addict, and it's this addiction is this whole person thing, and treatment is designed. Oh yeah, I know I have lots of time still. Yeah, I'm neurotic. I like to always look at my clock. But so yeah, it's focused on changing the whole individual. It's abstinence oriented. Oftentimes this even includes alcohol and cannabis. Again, with that whole person. It's not about reducing or eliminating your opioid use. It's about changing you from an addict into someone in recovery. Similarly, it's based on a medical moral model of addiction, the disease model. It's not always called that, but that's generally the framework we're operating in. You're conceived of as an addict, as someone who is both bad and sick, and the idea of methadone is to turn you into someone who is good and healthy. I should point out a little bit of the history of this ROM narrative, because it's important to know sort of why it became so powerful, in regards to methadone. So methadone, not surprisingly, from its inception, was unpopular. There were a lot of anti-drug, reactionary kind of voices saying, oh, don't give you're just swapping one drug for another, which is an interesting discourse that I'll talk about. But they're like, you shouldn't be giving, the drugs to addicts, blah, blah, blah. And they would try to shut methadone down. And the response to that, the people that would try to defend methadone would try to legitimize it through this medical language. And medical language is often used to legitimize deviance. So they would say, no, these people have a disease, they're sick, and methadone is not a drug, it is in fact a medication. And this sort of narrative, it became almost like a binary, where if you if you wanted to support methadone, you didn't have a whole lot of discourses available to you except this sort of medical narrative. So it became sort of the de facto way of supporting methadone. And I would say that's probably caused more problems than it solved, partially or largely because it doesn't really align with the way that people are using methadone. And what I mean specifically, I guess I would say it positions people that use drugs with way more agency over their treatment choices than they actually have. It sort of imagines that people come to this conclusion like, oh, I'm an addict, I have this disease, I'm sick, I need to go into treatment for this disease. Whereas the reality or my experience, I shouldn't say the reality, my experience and what I've seen both in my research and just being on methadone for 20 years is that people are forced to go onto methadone. The walls collapsed in on them because they are criminalized, they're stigmatized, and they have very little options, and it just keeps getting harder and harder and harder. And eventually they're like, okay, I'll go into methadone because I don't want to die, or I don't want my whole life to be flushed down the toilet. So this idea that it's a sort of a volitional choice, I think is way overstated by this idea of recovery. People make the decision to go into methadone in a context of constraint. And that's, I think, a much better way for us to think about it. And I think my own experience can be useful in describing this. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so methadone maintenance treatment, my own experience. I got on methadone in approximately 2005. My memory is a little bit off at this point, but about then. I was married at the time. Both my wife and myself were addicts, junkies in my parlance. We had been addicts for about 5 years, and we pretty much run out of our resources. We were at the end of our rope. We were broke. We were late on our rent. We had been kicked out of other apartments. We had burned all of our bridges with family and friends because our lives had sort of collapsed into having to lie and cheat and steal every single day. We were felons. We were on probation, and we weren't doing our probation. It's kind of, that's another story. I won't get into it. But it's really hard to do community service when you're, a heroin addict and you've got to score every day to stay well. So, our legal problems were mounting. All of our problems were mounting. And then additionally, every single morning we would wake up dope sick. And I remember it, your eyes would open in the morning and you'd be like, oh no, this reality is here again. I'm dope sick. And we had no money or resources. And we had to find some way every single day. It was like, how are we going to find money? Sometimes we'd have jobs and then we'd lose them. Sometimes we wouldn't have jobs, but we had to find money, which we had to do through scamming, lying, hustling, cheating, stealing, the standard, approach that all heroin addicts use. And then we'd have to go, we lived in Chicago at the time. We lived on the north side. And we'd have to go to the west side of Chicago, which is the main place where heroin is sold in Chicago, at least when I lived there. And so and it was a schlep. It was like 2 bus rides to get from one place to the other and then back. And it was dangerous because of police, not because of residents. Although there could have been dangerous with dealing with drug dealers too, but it was mainly police that was the fear. And we were arrested. So our whole lives had sort of collapsed into this depressing, sick, no resources, no future house of cards that was always in danger of collapsing and did collapse often. And so one day, actually, I was home alone. My wife did have a job at this point. She was had a part-time job at a veterinary clinic, which had some advantages because she was able to get some medications to us from time to time. But I was really sick this day, and I remember I was looking through the pockets of my pants, even though I'd certainly done that like a million times before. I was looking around my house for anything I could hawk. There was nothing. It looked like you might show the apartment to someone to rent out. It was that empty. And I did find that I had one TV left, and it was an old kind of crappy TV. And it was summer in Chicago, and I was like, I'm gonna lug this television down. I lived on like the 3rd floor. I'm gonna go downstairs and I walk a few blocks to the pawn shop to hawk this television. And it was horrible. I was dope sick. I was hot, burning hot in Chicago summer. I'm carrying this heavy TV. I'm sweating. I'm sick, desperate. And I get to the pawn shop, and the guy was like, "I'm not going to buy this crappy old television. What are you talking about?" So my world collapsed at that moment. I was like, "Now I actually had to. I was supposed to have to take it back." And I remember just putting down the television and sitting on it. And you might say I reached my rock bottom at that point. I don't really say that, I'm joking, but it kind of was. And I happened to notice that there was a methadone clinic right there. And again, I was only a few blocks. Well, I got to take a sip of coffee. I was only a few blocks from my house. So I see that there's a methadone clinic there, and it suddenly occurred to me, what am I doing with all this hustling and hassling and dope sickness? I could get my opioids at the methadone clinic instead of having to deal with this illegal market, which is unregulated and dangerous and illegal and problematic and far from my house. And that's what I did. So I want to be totally clear about this. I would have much preferred to continue using heroin. I love heroin. It was great. It was the context of criminalization that made it impossible, but that was the context. So it was impossible. And so I got on methadone as a pragmatic decision. It wasn't like ideological. It wasn't a treating a disease. It was, I need to get my opioids in a quasi-legal fashion rather than the unsustainable method that I'm using now. And it worked in a similarly pragmatic way. I was no longer dope sick ever because I had methadone every day. So that I remember it was amazing walking home from the clinic being like, I'm never going to get dope sick again. And it was just life changing. And because of that, I no longer had to spend all my time getting drugs or committing crimes or hustling to get money. And, then I could work, or I could go to school, and I could go grocery shopping, I could get a job, all of these things that were impossible, pragmatically impossible as a criminalized drug user, were now possible as a sort of legal drug user on methadone. And it was swapping an illegal drug for a legal drug, even though that discourse gets used in a lot of different ways. That's what it was, and that's why I benefited, because that was the variable. It wasn't went from an addict to someone in recovery. I went from someone who used illegal, criminalized, stigmatized opioids to someone who used less criminalized, stigmatized opioids. I did continue to use drugs, although less. I continued to use pot regularly every day. But I continued to use heroin as well. The difference, though, and this is a huge difference, was that I wasn't using heroin to stay one step ahead of withdrawal, which means I always had to use heroin every, 6 to 12 to 8 hours, a couple times a day, whatever it was. I could now make choices. I now had agency. I could use it when I felt like it, like any other kind of recreational drug. And if I felt it wasn't a good time, if I didn't have money, if my dealer didn't have it, and I thought the other dealer's product might be, this was before fentanyl, but whatever, if I thought the other product wasn't good, I didn't have to use it. I could use it as by my choice. And so eventually I started to do the research on methadone. I was interested in methadone because my own experience seemed to contrast with this dominant ideology so much. And when I looked at the scholarship, I realized that my perspective was totally absent. Methadone was always conceptualized through the addiction narrative, never conceptualized through this sort of sociological, pragmatic perspective that accounted for the war on drugs or accounted for the difference between legal versus illegal opioid use. It was always conceptualized through this narrative of sickness and addiction and recovery. And so I decided I was going to go to school. I was going to go to grad school and, change that, or at least holler to the hills that there's another perspective and to amplify the voices of people with lived experience. And that is, in fact, what I did. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so talk a little bit about my research. My research, as I mentioned, is mostly about methadone maintenance and buprenorphine treatment. It is mostly qualitative and ethnographic studies, although I have started to do some mixed method stuff and work with statistics. It will never be my thing. I'm not good at it, for one thing, but I also don't think it's the best way. I mean, it's useful for some things, but I don't think it's the best way of getting at the actual lives and meanings of marginalized people. So I mostly do qualitative and ethnographic work. I mostly focus on how well this institutional narrative of addiction and recovery aligns with the lives, practices, goals, needs of people on methadone and or people who are not on methadone that use illegal drugs. And of course, I've tried to center the voices and experiences of patients and people who use illegal drugs. Oh, now the button's working better. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical frameworks that I use to understand my data and to understand my research. Excuse me. So one of the biggies is medicalization, which is this framework of looking at how problems, issues that don't necessarily have to be understood as medical come to be seen as medical. So it's sort of a critique of a medical determinism that only looks at biology and does not account for structural issues like race or class or legality of the drug you're using. And this has been very useful to me to sort of point out the structural forces that play a role in people's drug use outcomes or treatment outcomes. So yeah. I also use an approach that's sometimes called a situated knowledge approach, which is a rejection of this idea that there is objective knowledge and that we as researchers can ascertain that objective knowledge through empirical methods. It rejects that. It says there is no sort of overhead position that the researcher can occupy where we can get neutral data. It's always going to be positional. It's always going to be partial. It's always going to be, related to the person collecting that data. So situated knowledge's approaches, I don't know if I said that right, are much more comfortable with social justice research. They stress being transparent about who you are and what your relationship to your study matter is. And it says like, hey, take this into account. I'm someone who used drugs. I'm someone on methadone maintenance. Know that when you read my research. Don't pretend that it's some sort of neutral thing, because it's not. And I want to talk a little bit more about this situated knowledge because it's kind of a funny story. As I mentioned, oh, whoa, that wasn't supposed to happen. Okay, hold on. I guess it doesn't matter. Okay, well, now it's back. Okay, so even though I mentioned that I went to school with the specific purpose of sort of elevating the narratives of people with lived experience, I almost really chickened out. When I was in graduate school, as you might expect, I kind of felt like an imposter. Here I was, this heroin addict, in the upper echelons of academia. And, neither of my parents went to college. My dad was a furniture salesman. And I felt like an imposter. I was susceptible to that sort of imposter syndrome. And there was this real emphasis, I was a sociology major, by the way, this real emphasis to be the neutral, objective researcher. And it was crazy to me at the time because in my theory classes, it would be Foucault, it would be Nietzsche, it would be Derrida. It was like, there's no such thing as objective knowledge. There's no such thing as unbiased research. And yet in the methods courses, it would be like, well, we're going to take a neutral position and, we're going to be objective. And it was just crazy to me. Maybe I was lucky in coming from sort of outside academia that this is so clear, this difference in the way they talked about it. But with the pressure in my dissertation, I did start off trying to take that sort of posture. When I did my interviews with people, I did not disclose my status at first. I just tried to sort of be the neutral, objective researcher trying to find out knowledge about this community that I supposedly didn't know that much about. And it was terrible. It was awful. The people that I was interviewing treated me exactly how I presented myself, which was as a total square, as some student who, doesn't have any thoughts about addiction and is just trying to collect this data. They clearly wanted to get the money I was paying them at the end of the interview. They would just respond according to the standard narrative, yes, I'm an addict. Yes, I want to be in recovery. I'm in methadone, blah, 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 blah. And I knew, because I'd been in methadone a long time at that point, that wasn't the way people talked about it. And I was like, what am I going to do? I had this crisis. This was my dissertation. And I eventually kind of came to the conclusion that, well, if it's going to go bad, I'm at least going to try to do it my way. So I started experimenting with a more organic interview structure, semi-structured interviews, if you will, or an ethnographic methodology toward interviews. And it was like the shades opened up. Like people that I was talking to, my interview participants, they would visibly relax their shoulders. They'd be like, oh my God, okay. So you understand. I could talk to you. I don't have to explain the minutia of these things that you're never going to get anyways. I could just talk to you. And in fact, I now have a lot of things I want to say about methadone, and I have a lot of opinions about drug use that I want to say. And it was wonderful. I got rich data, not objective data, but far more aligned with the actual real lives and views of people who are using drugs or on methadone. Yeah, it was wonderful. I'm so glad I did this, and it's been a process of experimenting. It doesn't go the same way every time. It doesn't always work perfectly, but I do generally now when I'm doing interviews in some way, shape, or form. Well, depending on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to a doctor, maybe I don't. But if I'm talking to people that use drugs, I try to let them know, I'm part of this community. I have some understanding of this, and that take that into account. And I also should point out that I think this is particularly important with marginalized populations. For one thing, marginalized populations, drug users, have every reason to lie to researchers. They're doing something that's illegal or something that they could get kicked out of their clinic for, as most people on methadone do use drugs, illegal drugs. So they have reasons to lie. They're used to lying. They don't trust researchers. There's a lot of good history of why they don't trust researchers. I can't get into it too much now, but they don't feel comfortable with researchers. They don't trust them, and again, for good reasons. But secondly, marginalized populations internalize dominant narratives, particularly if they're institutionalized, like in a system like methadone. This is Goffman for any sociologists out there. So they tend to start to think of themselves as, yes, this is my fault, why I'm being punished in this system. And I found that if you give them a safe space to be reflexive about their own experience, they will be. And you need to give them a safe space to be reflexive, just like any other marginalized population, how they whether it's Black people, poor people, disabled people, we internalize these narratives about us, and we need a safe space to be able to step out of that. And I try to give my participants that safe space. So let's talk a little bit about my findings. Okay. All right. So this is not one study or the other. I've done about 3 studies, maybe 4. And I'm kind of just talking about them all, and they all are kind of similar. So the main theme that's came up in my research is this misalignment between the institutional narrative about addiction and recovery and patients' goals. The people I spoke to, their narratives did not align with the institutional approach. And I have this little chart which describes it nicely. These buttons are really moody. Okay, so institutional narrative versus patient responses. So the ROM narrative, the recovery methadone narrative, it's very ideological and it's medically based. It stresses this idea of addiction to recovery. We're going to take bad, sick people and turn them into good and recovered people. Whereas my participant responses were much more pragmatic. They stressed the importance of reducing or eliminating the difficulties of illegal substance use, the hassles and harms of illegal substance use. In the ROM narrative, The harms of drug use are individually based, right? They are a symptom of addiction, or they're based in addiction. Whereas the patient responses, they position the harms as directly linked to the policy context of criminalization and the war on drugs. It was not about drug use itself, it was about illegal drug use. The ROM narrative, it requires abstinence. It's from all drugs, oftentimes cannabis or alcohol even. Whereas most of the people I spoke to did not want abstinence. They wanted stability. Some of them wanted to stop using heroin, but continue using other drugs. Some of them wanted to just use less heroin. Some of them wanted to use heroin safer. Some of them just said, hey, I just want my life to be more stable. It wasn't about abstinence. Some it was, of course, there was variety, but the majority, it wasn't. According to the ROM narrative, treatment was this holistic behavioral modification. It's about changing you, your whole person. The patients, they just wanted access to methadone, which would protect them from having to deal with the illegal market. So I think I'm going to let their responses say this better than I can. Okay. Come on. Okay. So circumventing criminalization, what I've sort of been talking about. A lot of people talked about how they used methadone to get opioids in a safer way than they were doing through criminalization. So Angela, a 32-year-old white female currently on methadone, she says, the criminalization and all that goes along with it, absolutely. That was the main reason I got on methadone, because, you get very sick and very ill. And that's why I feel like I did a lot of the stuff that people don't usually do in order to get the drugs. You know what I mean? It's the effects of not having it. So she's not talking about addiction and recovery. It's based on this lifestyle, this policy context of criminalized drug use. Okay. Tired of the hustle, similar kind of notion. People were sick and tired of doing all the things they had to do to get drugs on the illegal market. So Martin, 29-year-old Latino male, I'm tired of the chaos. I'm tired of losing the people I love, tired of the lifestyle. Steve, a 37-year-old white guy, he says, I got on methadone so that I wouldn't feel sick. It was strictly so that I wouldn't feel sick. I was like, you know what? I'm never going to get sick again. So again, people using methadone for this pragmatic reason to treat a problem that is endemic to being a criminalized drug use, that of withdrawal being a constant part of your life. Okay, so some people talk directly about how they did not want abstinence. This is Barry, a 33-year-old white male. He says, I didn't want abstinence from all illicit drugs by any means. I definitely wanted to stop the lifestyle that I was going to go back down. I don't think that the methadone community has the idea that abstinence as being the total goal of recovery. It's to get your life together. I mean, you can't be fucking going to the west side of Chicago, shooting dope in the bathroom at work. You've got to get high every 6 to 8 hours. There's no way to live a life like that. So, he wants stability. He doesn't want abstinence. He doesn't want to have to live the life of a criminalized drug user. And we'll actually see what happens to him later on with another slide. So look forward to that. Okay. Thank you for whoever just switched the slide. So not surprisingly, a lot of people talked about the increased dangers of illegal drug use associated with fentanyl and whatever else, xylazine, whatever else is in the drugs, as well as the inability to know how much you're taking whenever you use illegal drugs. So Sandra, a 55-year-old white female currently on methadone, she says, I think it was because the fentanyl was coming out and I had to do something in terms of like overdose. You don't know what's in the opioids on the illicit market. And then I wanted to get the fentanyl tested, but who's going to go through all that for a bag of dope? I'm not going to start testing it and doing all that. Then it just becomes a project. But that's the beauty of methadone. And a lot of people talked about this, how fentanyl drove them to methadone, even though they maybe didn't want to do it. The risks of illegal drug use had gotten so much that they were going to use methadone. And most of them did not use it for abstinence, but they used it in that way I kind of described earlier. Like if their dealer had a safe product that they knew, okay, they'll get it. But if not, they don't have to. So they used methadone as a way of gaining agency over their drug use and avoiding the dangers that are so common in the illegal market right now. So again, I should point out there was diversity. There were people that had the standard narrative. I see myself as an addict. I am pursuing abstinence-based recovery, and yeah, that's great. That was not the majority. It was the minority. Most had this more pragmatic view of treatment. Okay, so finding number 2. So not only did this ROM narrative, this addiction and recovery narrative, not really align, with patients' needs and goals, they often were a barrier to achieving them, or they lend themselves to policies that became barriers to patients achieving their goals. So what do I have written here? Abstinence-based and, so they lead to abstinence-based and punitive policies, which led people to drop out of methadone or to just avoid it wholesale. So this slide lists a little bit of how that happens. Next slide, please. Thank you. So how does the addiction recovery narrative affect the way that methadone is practiced? So according to this narrative, treatment becomes about behavioral modification, not harm reduction, right? It's about changing bad, sick people into good, recovered people. It's not about protecting people from the risk of overdose or the risk of fentanyl. It's about treating their addiction. And therefore, in methadone maintenance, we get counseling. And I should point out that the counseling is usually, almost always, not by sort of what you might think of as licensed counselors or psychologists. It's a much less, I don't know exactly what they need to get in different contexts to be a counselor, but it's not what you might call therapeutic counseling. And almost everyone in methadone just approaches it as a barrier to get through, that you just tell your counselor what they want to hear so you can get access to your methadone. Similarly, we have drug testing. It's often unethical, observed, humiliating drug testing, and it's almost always punitive. It is always punitive. We have 12 steps as a big part of it. Counselors will often recommend, sometimes require, that their patients go to 12-step programs, regardless of their views on 12 steps. It's highly regulated and punitive. Patients have no power in the system. It's I mean, for people that aren't on it, you would be amazed how paternalistic it is. Like, if you are standing in a long line at your methadone clinic and you're like, geez, I gotta be at work. In a normal situation, you could say, hey guys, okay, I'm late for work. Let's do the counseling tomorrow. No way. That can't happen in methadone. You have no power. That's going to instantly be taken as drug-seeking behavior or some sort of sneaky something or other, and it's going to be used against you. If you're late, and again, you have to go. Well, that's my next thing. You have to go every day. But if you're late, you can't just say, hey, I'm running late. There's none of that. It's incredibly paternalistic. Patients have no power in the system. And it's humiliating and stigmatizing to people. And of course, it is abstinence only. And there's diversity in clinics, a lot of diversity. Some of them don't care if you smoke pot or drink alcohol. Some of them do. Some of them don't care if you have a slip up. Some of them do. So we get a lot of diversity, but for the most part, they're pretty much abstinence only. You could get kicked out of your program for using drugs, or you will, if you keep using drugs in many cases. And the real way that this happens is through take-homes. And take-homes are, they're the medication given to patients so that they don't have to come to the clinic every day. You could take that medication home. But because of the abstinence orientation of methadone, if you're not completely abstinent, if you failed any drug tests recently, you will get none. You will have to go every single day. And it takes a really long time of building up clean drug tests in order to get, 1 or 2 or 3 take-homes. And as this is the biggest problem that the people I talked to had with the clinic. And it's not hard to understand why. I mean, it's impossible to go somewhere every single day. Or at least it's impossible to have a life, to work, to go to school. And this was the biggest frustration that people had. And in addition to having to go every day, there's a line, you don't know how long it's going to take. They might call you out of the line to say, hey, David, you know, we need to talk to you today. And again, and I can't say, oh, well, today's not a good day, let's do it tomorrow. So yeah, this made it impossible for patients to achieve their goals of obtaining stability. So again, I'm going to let them kind of describe it better than I do. Okay, next slide. So liquid handcuffs, and this is a term that people on methadone use to describe how the system is like handcuffs. The liquid is the methadone because it's mostly delivered in liquid form, and you're tied to the system. So Samantha, a 32-year-old white female who's no longer on methadone for this reason, says, I hate methadone because it's like liquid handcuffs. Say you want to go somewhere for a few days. You need take-homes, and if they won't give them to you, there's nothing you can do. The outside world or people that are not on methadone, they don't really understand what that's like. Take-homes are the biggest problem. Everyone has trouble with them, whether it's losing their job, or they can't go out of town, or they're just late, or they're sick. So yeah, I don't think it's too hard to understand, although I don't think that people who aren't on methadone have any sense of how hard it is, particularly if your clinic is far. And I think some of my participants do speak to this later on, so we'll let them do it. Oh, thank you. So people would talk about how this having to go every day was a barrier to stability. And remember, stability is what most of the people said they wanted out of methadone. So Dean, a 29-year-old Black male currently on methadone, he says, so basically the idea is to get back to living your regular life. But in a way, it kind of deters you from doing so sometimes, and especially at first. I had to go even on Saturdays. I mean, how the hell could I do a regular job like that? I can't get a 9 to 5. I don't know that I could definitely be there on time. And I should point out, he doesn't mention it, but you can't say to your boss, I'm late because I stopped at the methadone clinic, because it's so stigmatized. Almost everybody keeps it secret from their work, and people do and have got fired just for being on methadone. So they've got that to deal with. They don't know how long they're going to be at the clinic every single morning. And, you know, it gets in the way. You can't maintain a job. You can't go to school. And I should point out, in my own case, I would never have been able to get my PhD and stay in treatment without a couple things that helped me along the way. Because as I mentioned, I do still use drugs. I am not totally abstinent. One of the things that helped me was that I'm white, I'm male, and later on I had a PhD. And those things in combination was like the methadone lottery. I mean, I really get given a lot of passes that probably other people don't get given passes. My counselors talk to me in a different way. And that's been helpful. And I'll take any help I can get, because we're, you know, that's what harm reduction is about getting around unfair rules. There's also a lot of, as I mentioned, diversity in clinics. So I would look for the good ones. I've tried to restrict myself to living in big cities. I'm in New York now, the sort of the harm reduction capital. I was in Chicago before. Also a lot of harm reduction stuff going on there. So I would live in places where there would be harm reduction clinics, and I would seek out those clinics. When I moved to New York for my PhD, I was terrified. I mean, going to New York, that was part of how I chose which school to go to, which is unfortunate that you have to choose schools based on being a methadone patient. It all worked out, I'm not complaining. But yeah, I had to go somewhere where I was going to be able to not have to go every single day, because as you might imagine, it would be very difficult to get a PhD or do anything else when you're in that kind of system. And then last but not least, I have cheated on drug tests, particularly in the beginning. You know, I have used fake urine when I had to, because I had to, because the alternative of having to go back to the illegal market was just not feasible to me. And that's what would have happened. Now I go to a clinic actually where I get 28 days of take homes, and I can space out any drug use that I think might be a problem so that it doesn't come up when I'm going to be tested. And that's wonderful. I wish I didn't even have to do that, but you know, I'm very privileged compared to most other people on methadone. So next slide. So it's clearly a barrier to treatment initiation and retention. And Edward, a 30-year-old white male who's never been on methadone for this reason, as he says, we'll talk about this. So he says, That's probably going to be the #1 reason people don't want to get on methadone. You have to stand there in the morning, wait to get dosed, and it just sounds like a real pain. I lived in Pennsylvania, and at the worst time, I would have jumped on treatment in a second. But the closest clinic was in Lancaster, and that meant I would have had to drive up there every single day, which was a little over 2 hours each way. So I would have had to do that every single day. I mean, imagine that, 2 hours each way, and then at least an hour at the clinic. That's 5 hours of your day every day. Now, most of the times the clinic isn't 2 hours away, although it often is, but even a half an hour away. I mean, that's a lot of time you're asking of people. And a lot of people, a lot of my participants would say, I would have loved to be on methadone. I would love to be on methadone, but I can't abide by this system. So I have to deal with this super dangerous, super pain in the neck world of being a criminalized drug user. Next slide. Okay, so harm production. Okay, so this is Barry again. So I knew Barry in Chicago. We went to the same clinic. We bought dope together a few times, and we went to this cool clinic. They didn't bother him. Barry liked to drink a lot, and they didn't care because they were looking at the larger picture. He was doing much better. I think he did totally quit heroin, and that was fine with the clinic that he occasionally drank or smoked pot. But he moved. He moved from Chicago to Cape Cod, where they only had one clinic. And not surprisingly, this one clinic was a real abstinence-based, recovery-oriented kind of clinic. And this is what he says. He says, normal people go to bars. Wait, is that? Oh, okay, this is a little bit different than what I've written. So I'm just going to read this. This will be slightly different. So he says, I was able to do the things that normal people do at my old clinic. Oh, okay, here it comes. Normal people go to bars. Normal people smoke weed. Normal people do those things when they want to do them. Now, if you're going to tell me, because when I was between the ages of 16 and 22, I shot dope and I was a heroin addict, fine, you can say that, but don't let that define the rest of my life. Don't tell me I can't go to a pub and have some beers. Don't tell me I can't smoke a joint with my buddies, because that is bullshit. You just want to live a regular life, and they try to impede on you living a regular life. And that's where it bothers me. And that's where I say, you know what? Fuck it. And that's why I said, fuck it in Massachusetts. And Barry, in fact, did say fuck it in Massachusetts. He quit his clinic, not wanting to, but he quit his clinic. And the next month, he was dead of a fentanyl-involved overdose. So I really want to point out, or especially to any treatment providers that are listening, providers like to talk about the risks of giving people take-homes. What if they divert? What if they overdose? But you really need to think about risk contextually. Think about what are the risks of not giving this patient take-homes. And we know what those risks are. The risks are people get pissed off, frustrated, they can't become stable, the treatment doesn't work for them, and they quit and return to the vastly more risky illegal market. So the idea that something like smoking pot can is miscalculated in this risk calculation is just insane and is leading to a lot of people dying. And of course, I know it's probably obvious to everyone, but especially in this context of overdose crisis, of fentanyl, of xylazine, who cares if someone smokes pot if they're on methadone? And I should also point out that during COVID, as many of you probably know, we were given more take-homes. People that use drugs on methadone were given take-homes because of the risks of gathering together. So they made, it didn't happen to everyone because there, again, diversity in clinics. Some clinics were like, we're not giving more take-homes to anyone because we don't believe in this. But a lot of people did get more take-homes, people that use drugs. And so that gave us as researchers a sort of natural experiment to see, oh, what happens to people that didn't get take-homes and now do? And what we found out was that overdoses did not go up, diversion did not go up, and in fact, the expected result happened. People were thrilled. They were like, oh my God, I can get my kids off to school in the morning now. I can get to work on time. I feel like I'm treated like an adult now. This is wonderful. My treatment is so much better. I care about it now. I don't hate it as much. So I think that's important to point out. I would also, I think I might be skipping ahead to another slide, but I brought it up. You know, diversion. Sorry. I didn't mean to skip. Thank you. Diversion is a similar kind of red herring. You know, big deal if someone diverts their methadone. What that probably is going to mean is that somebody on the illegal market is going to get a safe, regulated, non-adulterated drug that they know the milligrams of, rather than a bag of heroin, fentanyl, whatever else is thrown in it. So I think this concern with diversion is a mischaracterization of the risks that are actually involved with illegal drug use as compared to the risks of diverting methadone. So actually, I want to skip 2 slides ahead now. Thank you. So ignore this first bullet point. I would have, that's a mistake. So methadone does a lot of good regardless of whether people achieve abstinence. And I think, again, providers need to understand this. It doesn't have to be about abstinence. Methadone reduces the frequency of opioid use. I went from using heroin a couple times a day, every single day, to using here and there, you know, once a month, maybe. Sometimes I mean, with the way things have gotten so dangerous, now not even that. I mean, it's getting rarer and rarer, which I don't really like, but yeah, so it reduces the frequency of opioid use. It clearly reduces overdose, transmission of disease, eliminates the need to hustle and commit crimes all day so people can be more stable, eliminates withdrawal. And let me point out here, because I'm working on a study on withdrawal right now, and the way it sort of plays into people's willingness to engage in risky activity. And it is, I mean, sometimes people say, oh, withdrawal is like the flu, withdrawal is not that big of a deal. Withdrawal is a super big deal and a huge motivator for people that use drugs. I mean, for one thing, it's a motivator to get involved with methadone, but it's a motivator to just get rid of the withdrawal in any way that you can. And they will take risks that they would not normally take if they were not in withdrawal. So one of the people that I spoke to in the study I'm currently working on, she was dope sick, really sick, and she was with her friend who she knew had Hep C, and the participant did not have Hep C. She was Hep C negative. The person she's hanging out with has Hep C, and they had no needles. So she shared the needle with the Hep C positive person, totally knowing that she was in that moment contracting Hep C, because she had withdrawal. And as she put it to me, you know, of course, as you know, I was dope sick. What am I going to do? Of course, I shared the needle. And I have had so many people tell me similar kinds of stories about how they hurt people when they were in withdrawal that they wouldn't have done otherwise, how they've lied to their parents, how they've done various kinds of sex work that they weren't comfortable with, taken risks, bought drugs from people that they didn't trust, all because of withdrawal. It's this huge vector of risk. So if you're just eliminating people's withdrawal on methadone, you are doing a wonderful job, whether they use dope occasionally or not. And again, as I mentioned, it provides agency over substance use in the way I just described, allows people to work, go to school, become stable. But this important caveat at the end, it doesn't do any of that if people avoid it or drop out. So all these people, this 85% of people who might benefit from methadone, they're not getting any of these benefits that they could be getting if we reduced the threshold and reduced the focus on abstinence. Okay, where am I at time, by the way? Can anyone just tell me? 10 minutes left? Okay, cool. Okay, so the overdose prices, again, you all probably know this. Overdoses have been skyrocketing. The last 10 years, it went from 21,000 to 69,000. In the last year, we've had 100,000 drug overdoses. I think that's actually supposed to be drug overdose deaths. At the same time, we're still dealing with Hep C and HIV. And they are, of course, linked to injection drug use, as we know. So let's go to the next slide. Make sure I finish on time. There's an ambulance outside my house. Hold on one second. I'm going to take coffee. I can power through. Okay, so what am I recommending? How do I think methadone should be organized? Well, not surprisingly, I'm a harm reductionist, and I want methadone to be organized according to harm reduction, not according to abstinence. So for those of you who don't know, I think probably most of you know, harm reduction is this alternative philosophy to abstinence. You hear it described in a lot of different ways, particularly as it's got more popular in public health. But it has a neutral position on drug use. It's not sort of saying drug use is good or bad. It's concerned with eliminating the harms that go along with drug use, and particularly with criminalized drug use. Not only, because there are harms even with legal drug use. It's about patient autonomy. So patients are allowed to sort of chart their own path through treatment, say their own goals, whether that be abstinence or using less or using safer or going from injection use to snorting. It's what the patient wants. And similarly, it respects incremental change. So those kinds of changes I just described, using less, using safer, are valued. It's not a binary. It's not about, oh, you're either a complete drug addict or you're a recovered abstinent person. It respects incremental change. Similarly, it's pragmatic. The risks should be seen in context. So the risks of a legal kind of drug use should be seen against the risks of illegal drug use, or the risks of giving someone take-homes should be seen against the risks of not providing them with take-homes. And of course, it's non-coercive, it's not punitive. And lastly for this slide, clinicians really need to understand that people are in methadone maintenance to a large degree to escape the world of criminalized drug use and all of the risks and hassles that go along with it. They're not all seeking abstinence. Sometimes they say it because they've been forced to say it so much, but they're seeking a way out of this impossible policy context of having to buy on the illicit market with the war on drugs and everything that we know goes along with that. So keep that in mind, clinicians. Next slide, please. Okay, so I also want to talk briefly about some of the discursive problems, not necessarily on the clinic level, but some of the discursive problems with conceptualizing methadone through this addiction recovery narrative. So this narrative, ROM, addiction recovery, it really obscures the role of policy, criminalization, and the war on drugs as a source of harm in drug users' lives. It positions those harms individually. And what I mean by this is that, so my data showed that people who use illegal drugs, who then find relief in methadone, the variable that they were talking about, and the variable I saw in my own experience, was a legal variable. I went from using illegal opioids to legal opioids, and that made a huge difference in my life. It took me from like a street junkie to a professor. Again, it was not this individual kind of, I went from becoming an addict to an addict in recovery. That wasn't the thing, and that's not the thing a lot of people talk about. But this ROM narrative goes around and switches all that up and takes these pragmatic, policy-based problems that people are having and frames them individually through the narrative of addiction. And similarly, when people are successful on methadone, it does the same thing. This ROM addiction recovery narrative says, oh, look, you're doing better. You have treated your addiction. You're now in recovery. Whereas that hides the fact that, well, actually, I just found a way to access opioids outside of criminalization. And now I get my opioids legally rather than illegally. So it's a wonderful narrative for the war on drugs, for criminalization, because it completely obscures both of those things and drug policy generally as a giant source of harm in the lives of people who use drugs that drives them towards the safer kind of drug use available in methadone. Okay, so we're getting close. So obviously, I think we need to rethink methadone. We need to think about the harms of drug use and the benefits of treatment in this larger structural policy-based context. We need to recognize that the war on drugs is a force of harm, a force of oppression for people who use drugs, and that they make their treatment decisions in that setting. I often kind of think if methadone treats anything, it treats criminalization more so than addiction. And similarly, we need to conceptualize methadone as harm reduction, acknowledge that methadone is a form of decriminalized opioid use. We're still using opioids here. It's not like we're drug-free now. Methadone is an opioid. We just went from using illegal ones to legal ones. acknowledged that methadone is a form of safe supply, admittedly a very imperfect form of safe supply, but that's kind of a way that people are using it. And acknowledge that it's just a practical way of avoiding withdrawal, overdose, disease transmission, improving quality of life, pragmatic things rather than these sort of ideological addiction recovery kind of narratives. Okay, so next slide. So I don't want to get too into this. I don't have time to get too into this. That's probably a good thing. But I do think that social scientists are going to eventually have to become much more critical of the narrative of addiction, addiction as a sort of social construct. I don't know if any of you have read Helen Keene's The Trouble with Addiction. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a deconstruction of addiction, pointing out the problems, and there are many. I'm sure some of us are familiar with many of the sort of diagnostic and etiological problems that go along with this idea of addiction. It's kind of like a moral narrative that masquerades as science. And just a real brief sort of example, the linchpin, as we all know, of addiction is drug use harm. Are you experiencing harm from your drug use? But that's a problem because who defines the harm? So just as an example, so let's say somebody loses their job to go smoke pot. That might be seen as harm of addiction. And that's therefore a diagnostic symptom. Okay, you're an addict. You lost your job to go smoke pot. But, is this a job at McDonald's? Are you 16 or 60? Is this a career? Did you like your job? Are you a communist? There's a lot that goes into it. Or race. We know that Black people or other minorities are much more likely to lose their job or to have trouble getting a job or to get arrested from drugs than white people. Yet that then becomes sort of built into the diagnostic criteria. These racial class-based inequalities become built in to the way that we diagnose addiction. And methadone maintenance in itself, of course, is the biggest way to problematize addiction because it shows the world, hey, if you give addicts their drugs, their symptomology disappears. Or not maybe disappears, because I don't want to say there's no, of course drugs are physical components that have risks involved with them, but a large portion of the symptomology disappears because it's related to the policy context of criminalization and war on drugs. So yeah, methadone maintenance, and that's again why that whole ROM narrative has gained such strength, because it sort of defends against deconstructing addiction by, little sleights of hand. Oh, methadone's a medicine, it's not a drug. Okay, so my takeaways. Methadone in its current iteration is not working. Everyone hates it, and they don't stay on it. They don't get involved in it, and they quit when they are. The current approaches don't align with the actual needs and goals of people on methadone, and this leads to high rates of dissatisfaction, dropout, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, poor health outcomes like overdose. We need to be more critical about the theoretical frames that we use for understanding drug use and treatment. And that basically means we need to look at structure, policy, race, class, and not just this individually based narrative of addiction and recovery. Harm reduction is a more practical, more ethical way of understanding and addressing treatment. And please be concerned with the importance of experiential knowledge, people with lived experience. I mean, the idea that that people who know most about drug use and treatment should be excluded from the conversation is just crazy. And I think that's changing, but we need to continue to go in that direction. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge that my work was supported by NYU, by grants, by my mentors, Honoria Guarino, Pedro Mateo Gelibert, and David Perlman, as well as to my friends and collaborators, Susan Walters and Laura Kahan, who helped with their work doing data collection and analysis. And lastly, I just want to thank all of you for listening to my unhinged rant, and I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
Wow, I think that was the opposite of an unhinged rant. I think it was
Thank you.
maybe rambling, but really informed and passionate, and obviously informed by the combination of your lived experience and your academic experience. And I think for many people, it's that combination that is really interesting and intriguing. And I maybe want to start with a question there. First of all, just to say that there were so many, thumbs up and acknowledgements and accolades about many of the things that you were talking about as we went. So I can't reiterate all of those, and I hope you get to see some of them in the chat. But with respect to your work, there were two comments in the chat that I want to read out and get your take before talking about so many other aspects around the practicalities of what you're talking about. So one person posted, "I like that sociology of knowledge looks at the values and motivation of researchers. It helps improve objectivity." Someone else posted, "Isn't the concept of pursuing truth foundational to the scientific method? If we abandon this principle and accept that all knowledge is relative, what happens to medical practice? Won't we just fragment into tribes? And is that already happening?" So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes. I mean, I think, well, okay, so the first one, well, could you tell me the first one again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the first one said, "I like that sociology of knowledge looks at the values and motivations of the researchers. That helps to improve objectivity."
Okay, yeah. I don't know if it helps to improve objectivity. I think sociology of science often is critical of objectivity, but maybe that's just a rhetorical semantic kind of difference, because I certainly think it helps in improving the overall knowledge, or the overall, in having more realistic forms of knowledge. But yeah, I don't know about objectivity, but I do certainly agree with the comment that sociology of science acknowledges the positionality of the researcher, and I think that's to the benefit of everyone. Regarding the next question, like what's going to happen, if we do these kinds of things, these kinds of questions and comments have been raised, since Nietzsche. Are we going to devolve into chaos and anarchy, if we don't have objective truth? And I don't know. I don't know. I don't think that we should sort of try to come up with epistemological frameworks that fit some sort of future desire. Like, I think epistemological frameworks have to represent our legitimate analysis of the world. And in terms of the scientific method, I don't use it. I'm critical of it. I sometimes, of course, use elements of the scientific method. I do research that might be called standard kinds of research. I have samples, I have methodologies, I have conclusions, I write papers, but no, I think the scientific method is kind of a good way of gatekeeping particular kinds of knowledge. It's a good way of leaving out more in-depth forms of knowledge. It's a good way. It's a good way of gatekeeping against sort of better understandings of the world. And I don't really think that we're going to descend into nihilistic anarchy. For one thing, these narratives are never going to become the dominant frameworks of the world. This is an academic kind of conversation. But I think that in contrast to that, we will actually come up with far better ways of understanding people and populations and their needs and goals if we take a step back from the scientific method and understand that all knowledge is contingent and that there isn't going to be a universal truth. These kinds of scientific methods and the research that they've generated have been used to oppress people, marginalized people, whether that be racial, class, disability, drug users. They always lean towards normativity, and they always lean towards sort of a quantitative backup kind of thing that just sort of validates the status quo. So I think more liberatory ways of thinking will come from maybe not abandoning the scientific method, but certainly from taking a step back from it.
Well, I think you're using your research in ways that are advocacy. And I
Yes.
wonder if you think that clinicians working in addictions from across the different sort of disciplines have an inherent role or an obligation to become involved in advocacy for people who use substances and for changes.
Yes and no. I think it's a complicated question. My initial response is yes, but clinicians could be a lot of different things. A lot of people that work in methadone are, excuse me, I have to hiccup or burp. Thank you, sorry. A lot of people that work in methadone clinics are underpaid, undervalued. They don't have the kind of training or privilege that would maybe let them find out about advocacy. They kind of, you know, the system, it's a systemic thing more than an individual thing. They don't have time. They got to do their paperwork and treat their clients. I do think that maybe the doctors, the directors that should have a better view of how screwed up the system is do have an obligation to step out and be public and say, like, this is not working for people. So yeah, but I think it's complicated, and I think the system in itself creates the problems more than the individuals in that system.
Yeah, I was really thinking about that. There were so many comments in the chat as we went about people acknowledging, I think both people who are prescribers and professionals and people with experience about the many, many barriers experienced in attending pharmacies and attending clinics. And, you know, it really is striking to think about how people working within that space are so impacted by stigma, I guess, notions of stigma and notions of addictions that you've addressed, you know, and how we can seek to change that.
I would point out, just in addition to that, we do see real differences between the way buprenorphine is administered as opposed to methadone. And I just did a study talking to methadone treatment providers and buprenorphine treatment providers, and it was night and day. The buprenorphine providers were all about harm reduction, were all about, you know, the structural context of criminalization, and totally believed in harm reduction. Whereas the methadone prescribers were far more suspicious. They didn't like their doctoral authority being challenged by lived experience or by patients, and, you know, they wanted control. So I think change is certainly possible, and we see it in buprenorphine. And I think that also, again, to reference the structural element, buprenorphine has a different policy context than methadone. It has a different cultural context than methadone. But I think that does sort of shine a spotlight that it doesn't have to be like this. You know, we can do things differently.
Yeah, and certainly in our context, buprenorphine and methadone can coexist within the same care setting. It's not a choice between one or the other. So that
I
seems
think
like
they
such
can
an
in some
unreasonable-
settings here too.
Okay.
Not all, but some.
Okay. There was a question about back to your own experience and how you sort of made that transition, starting on methadone as treatment and harm reduction, and then ultimately, you know, entering school and completing your PhD. And I guess, you know, the question comes from a place of curiosity around maybe, you know, what some of those challenges or facilitators were. I know you acknowledged privilege as being one of those.
Mhm.
And then I'm going to add on to that with my own question, because you've really talked about harm reduction as a spectrum and allowing people to make a choice, including recovery, and that you continue to use opioids however often. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, for you, whether that counts, what you define or how you define recovery for yourself in that context. So that's a lot of things wrapped up in there, but coming back.
Right, yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I'll try to address them all. So the transition was from sort of going from someone who was super on the margins to someone who isn't. A lot of it took place in the first few years of being on methadone. And I think this is kind of important to point out. In those first few years, which is when I had to go every day to the clinic and had to deal with all this, you know, the difficulties of it, I was at that point just so grateful. Maybe grateful isn't the right word, but so great, for lack of a better word. I was so grateful that I was no longer in the gutter anymore. I was just so grateful to be able to go grocery shopping that I didn't really care that I was having to deal with the bureaucracy and the things I critique about methadone. In the beginning, for me, they weren't such a big deal. The clinic that I went to, as I mentioned my story, was a few blocks down from my house. I lived in Chicago, so I was able to just sort of go to the clinic, and it was a cool clinic. It was a harm reduction clinic, and then get on the Chicago L train to go to work. So I, for one thing, had an easier time dealing with a lot of the barriers. But I think a lot of people in the beginning are kind of willing to put up with them because they're like, well, this is better than where I was 2 months ago. And then it's sort of later on where you start being like, wait a minute, I want to be treated like a human. I'm an adult. So that went along with my transition. I was willing to put up with things. And now I've forgotten the part that you added on, which was interesting, and I wanted to speak to it.
I think it was about whether, you identify as being in recovery, and what does that mean for you?
I do not. I don't identify as being in recovery. I don't feel like there was anything I had to recover from. I see myself as being someone who likes using opioids. I wanted, like most people, to use them as safely as possible. I did the best I can under very difficult circumstances with criminalization. And then I found a better way of doing it with methadone. So no, this whole narrative of I was an addict and I'm in recovery, I don't identify through that whatsoever. I don't see I had anything to recover from. I was a criminalized person, and I found a way of making that a little better.
Thanks for that. Lots of questions related to that. One that came up in the chat I'll pose asks, if drug use is removed from criminalization, what is the best way to regulate it, if any? Can you comment on current regulation of legal drugs, specifically alcohol and tobacco? And I guess in the US, in some states, cannabis is legalized, right? And in others, not.
Yes.
So.
I mean, I'm not an expert on policy, but I definitely think regulation is the answer to the drug poisoning crisis that we have going on right now. People don't overdose because of heroin, or they don't overdose because they are addicted. They overdose because the $10 bag of what they hope to be opioids, they have no idea what the amount is. They have no idea what's in it. They have no idea if any of the heroin is in it. They know probably it has fentanyl, probably it has other stuff, but these are poisoning deaths. These aren't overdoses. And if we regulate it, like, if we applied this unregulated context to alcohol, like we did back in Prohibition, people went blind from drinking alcohol. If you had no idea how much alcohol was in any beer you drank, and it could likely have enough to kill you in one sip, and it could have a bunch of other stuff that might do horrible things to you in it, we would see just as much pathology from drinking alcohol. We would probably call them poisoning accurately, which we don't do in the case of heroin. So yeah, if we regulated opioids, like we do for pain patients, where we don't see anywhere near the amount of morbidity or overdose or death, where someone could be like, here's the amount of milligrams of the drug that I want to take, and I know that this is that drug and is not other drugs. That's the answer, like we do with any other kind of substance, alcohol and cigarettes. In terms of like the minutia of the regulation, like how old should you be? I don't know exactly what I mean, probably in a standard way that we regulate any other kind of intoxicating substance like alcohol. But I am a huge believer in legalizing and regulating. And I think it's the nose on our face, with this overdose crisis, that we need to start thinking about it in this context, that people aren't dying from addiction or even from heroin use. They're dying from being poisoned from the other stuff that I know some people do want fentanyl at this point, but that emerged from them having no choice but to get fentanyl. So I see these as poisoning deaths.
Thanks for that. There's a question about how much discussion of the Portugal experience is discussed in the United States.
Not enough. So, I know some things about the Portugal experience. I can't even remember the exact things right now, but I know drug use was decriminalized. I hear different things about what exactly that means in Portugal, and I don't want to speak to it because it's not my expertise.
Mhm.
But I certainly think other countries who have experimented with alternatives to criminalization, we need to be borrowing from their ideas, including some of the stuff going on in Vancouver with the Safe Supply initiatives. But yeah, we don't know enough about Portugal, and we don't talk about it enough. And the United States is terrible about this kind of stuff. There's this idea that's wrapped up in exceptionalism of Americans that, well, of course, we know that we're number one, we're doing everything. Who's Portugal? And that needs to change because we do almost everything wrong in regard to drugs. So yeah, not enough, and I'd like to know more. My screen is suddenly just grayed out. I don't know why that happened. Maybe I'll move my cursor around. Okay.
That's okay. I think we have sort of one more minute. I guess if I could wrap up with a question that's really meaningful to me, and I think to many others on this call, it would be, are there any other specific thoughts that you want to share with us about how to make OAT, so opioid agonist treatment, and with whatever the medication is and its care, more person-centered?
Take it out of the clinic system, or even just offer people alternatives to the clinic system. I know this question, like, do we want to get rid of the clinic system or just make alternatives, comes up in the community a lot. And some people do like the clinic system, for better or for worse. But I think a great way of changing the game would be to have it prescribed like buprenorphine is, through a primary care provider who would be inclined to give you more patient-centered treatment. Yeah, I think it's kind of, people are starting to come around to this in the United States, to recognize how much a problem the clinic is. So yeah, let's take it out of the clinic system.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are so many structural things built into those models, both here in Canada as well, that need to really be recognized. But again, lots of issues around training, workforce, even payment for people working in that system, and then some of the other issues that you alluded to and we haven't had time to talk about today in terms of other aspects around race and marginalization. So
absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking and very well-received talk to set off our couple of days of learning. I don't know whether you have a chance to come to a session on looking at new frameworks for take-home dosing.
I will, for sure.
Certainly that, connects very much with what you're saying.
Yes.
And for me, and for the people who worked with us on that in this draft guidance, prompts a lot of thinking about the risks and balances that you've alluded to, and reframing those. So sorry, I keep sort of referring to that because it's top of mind for me. There are many, many great sessions throughout the next couple of days. I encourage people to check out all of them. Please don't forget to fill out your evaluation for this session and for every session that you attend, as well as for the end of each day. I am going to remind you also that we have a break after this session for everyone to process and then come to our next sessions ready to focus again. Please remember to visit the poster and exhibition booths by clicking on the booth button at the top of the screen. We're moving into a half-hour break. The first concurrent sessions of the conference will start at 11. And I think that's it. David, I want to thank you again. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you all.
It's been a pleasure to hear your voice live, having read your work, but it comes off the page, obviously, with such energy and passion. And I know that you've gotten a lot of people thinking. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Been
Have a
great.
great conference.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing everyone back in half an hour.